Hi everyone, it's William here, back with the Grand Duke Dmitri YouTube series, video series, and you notice I'm not saying the 1915 diary series because we're done with those, although we are still roughly in the same time period. I'm really excited about the material I have today. I said yesterday that I was going to be looking through my things, trying to find something that I could use for today. At short notice, because I hadn't planned ahead for the ending of the 1915 diary series. We ended in November, mid-November. I think it was November 12th, and Dmitri was just on the road with Nicholas, as part of Nicholas's suite and one of his adjutants, on the train, I should say, moving from town to town and reviewing troops. All right, and today we have something quite different, and it is annoying that I don't know the date. I believe, so the topic today is Dmitri's pre-revolutionary mistress for the last 1 or 2 years of his life in Imperial Russia, leading up to the Rasputin assassination, but I don't know the precise length of time. And this material is unfortunately undated, at least the excerpt that I have. I don't have the entire work, and I don't know how long the entire work is. So Karalli was an actress, and she on the stage in Russia, and then even before the revolution, she'd started doing silent films. And she figures in the Rasputin assassination. We find out the truth about what she was doing during the Rasputin assassination. We'll find that out later from Dmitri himself in his diaries. And he presents what seems to me a very accurate account of that night. And in the meanwhile, yeah, she was his mistress at that time. Now, whether she became his mistress in 1915 or in 1916, I don't know. I suspect 1916 because we have a very good idea of what he was doing in 1915, even though we end in November. And the women he was seeing and the women he was pursuing, and her name isn't mentioned once, even when he is with theater people whom he adored. But yeah, other than that, the only thing I'll say in the lead up is that she, whenever anybody who had contact with a Grand Duke is writing about their contact with that Grand Duke, there's a tendency to make it as ego boosting as possible for the person in question. So, for instance, I mentioned once that my colleague Ed told me about an instance where I can't remember the man, but he'd gone hunting with Dmitri, and he'd outshot Dmitri, and Dmitri had this absolutely lovely, expensive, top-of-the-line shotgun. I think it was Bird's. And Dmitri's excuse for being outshot was that his shotgun wasn't any good. And he offered to trade with this guy who'd done so much better. And this guy had this beat-up old shotgun, and he said, sure, I'll trade. And then afterwards, in what he wrote, you know, he was kind of sniggering at Dmitri. Yes, this silly Grand Duke, he thought that he could blame it on his gun, and I pulled the wool over his eyes. I got that expensive gun. You know, Dmitri he wasn't an avid hunter, but he knew how to shoot. We know from his diary entries that, as going back to 14, that he was an avid shooter of birds. He did it from childhood on, and I just, you know, and also he was never puffed up about sports and his failure at sports. It bothered him, but he always blamed himself. And so when you're dealing with people writing about Grand Dukes, whether it's women who had liaisons with them or men who encountered them in some other capacity, they tend to take this kind of patronizing attitude. of, oh yeah, you know, he was madly in love with me, or yeah, I beat him and he tried to, you know, blame it on something else, so on and so forth. So bear that in mind. I mean, this certainly is a true account so far as it goes, but the you know, the perspective may be a little exaggerated. So, as I said, I can't give you a date, but this would be probably 1916. Okay, here we go. This is Karalli. Ah, my little dog. It wasn't by chance that I got to know Dmitri Pavlovich, and our first meeting had the quality of an inspection. The bridegroom taking a look at his prospective bride, and the bride taking a look at her prospective bridegroom! Exclamation point. It happened like this. He could often be found at the home of my friend Nina Nestorovskaya, a former Petrograd ballerina whom I had known since childhood and with whom I finished school in the same year. She also knew Leonid Vitalyevich Sobinov very well and sometimes came to visit us, and we visited her. Then she went off with Gavril Konstantinovich, the son of Konstantin Konstantinovich, leaving the ballet, and after the revolution, Gavril Konstantinovich married Nina. So, on his frequent visits to him, he, Dmitri, always said, "You and Gavryusha are so lucky. You have a happy, companionable life. Gavryusha is lucky to have found a wife and friend like you." But he, Dmitri, I'm just making a note of something. Dmitri, was completely alone and had not yet met a single woman who could meet his wants and needs and wouldn't care whether he was a Grand Duke or a carpenter. To this, Nina responded, "It just so happens that I know such a person. I think she would satisfy your tastes and requirements because, to the surprise of all, she has cast aside all her millionaire suitors and lives off her own modest means. You cannot buy such a person!" Exclamation point. Dmitri was, of course, surprised and dying of curiosity. Who was she? Where did she live? What kind of person was she? Etc. Then Nina told him who I was and showed him a postcard with my photograph, after which D decided to go immediately to Moscow and present himself to me, and asked Nina to write me a letter of introduction that he could pass along. It so happened that Nina had a handkerchief that I had left behind when I was visiting her, and Nina said, "Here's her handkerchief. Take it with you and give it to her from me." Without a moment's hesitation, DP got on a train and went to Moscow, bearing my handkerchief, but alas, he did not find me in Moscow. I was making a film in Sochi, and Leonid Vitalyevich was with me. Upon my return from Moscow, I found his visiting card, hand-signed, and the cook told me that some handsome officer had been there. Okay, let's stop with that. We have more of this text about how she first got together with Dmitri, and when we're done with that, we'll go to her, what she writes about the Rasputin assassination. So this is very, very interesting stuff. Okay, so what to say about this? Well, I did make notes, didn't I? Yes. Okay, this reference to the wife, like a bridegroom looking at a wife. Yeah, you know, mistresses, it's ironic, but for single men who didn't want to marry outside their social class or make an undynastic marriage, the mistress was often the wife, more or less, the companion. I suppose that was true with married men too. When it was an unhappy marriage, sometimes the mistress, it wasn't just a matter of having a woman at your, to visit whenever you wanted for sex, but also a lot of times for consolation and companionship in an unhappy marriage. Anyway, there was also this phenomenon that, I don't know if Dmitri would have applied it to his girlfriend at Shots Out, but there was also this concept of a sanatorium wife. You might be in a tuberculosis sanatorium for years and years, and if that was the case, you would have a companion there of the opposite sex, possibly a lover, So we know that Grand Dukes did marry their mistresses. They did make them real wives. So Andrei and Boris Vladimirovich would marry their mistresses after the revolution. Prince Gavril Konstantinovich, would marry his mistress after the revolution. And that was not going to happen with Dmitri. Even if he didn't make a dynastic marriage, he was not going to marry someone from the demi-monde. He was not. And what rings true in this account, what rings very true, if you remember from the 1921 diary entries, is that he had such a yearning for such a really existential need for a woman to provide him with a hearth and home. And even though Karalli would never do that, she answered part of that question, and she seems to have settled him down a little. As you have seen from the 1915 diary entries, he was all over the place in terms of women. And it's very interesting the way he puts it, because he had lots of female friends, and yet he did have a hard time connecting to women beyond sex, or the quite a bit older women that he had as sort of mother surrogates. Well, sometimes they were lovers too. But, when she quotes him as saying, "You and Gavrusha are so lucky, you have a happy, companionable life. Gavrusha is lucky to have found a wife and friend like you." So this is interesting, because Dmitri was calling Nina Gavril's wife long before they were married, long before the revolution. And she says he was completely alone. He hadn't met a single woman who could meet his wants and needs, and who wouldn't care whether he was a Grand Duke or a carpenter. And she makes it a point to say that the reason she recommended Karalli to Dmitri was not only because she was a beautiful, glamorous woman, but was because she had cast aside all her millionaire suitors and lived off her own modest means. So she didn't care about money. And she was... she didn't care about status. She didn't care if he was a Grand Duke or a carpenter. And I sincerely believe, from what Dmitri wrote in later diary volumes, that was important to him. He really did want someone who loved him. And, he writes about that explicitly in 1921, about how he understands that for practical purposes, he can't marry a woman who doesn't have money, and he really grapples with that, because what he wants is someone who is genuinely going to be a life companion. So, yeah, that to me is very, very credible. He was looking for someone who could be that. And Nina Nestorovskaya thought that these were qualities that Karalli had. So that's interesting, I think. Now, as we go along, we'll see, and already she's talking about how aggressively he's pursuing her. He immediately takes the train to Moscow without bothering to find out if she was even there or not. When she's not there, he leaves his visiting card, and he doesn't follow her to Sochi anyway. He probably couldn't. I mean, he still had duties. But as we go on, you'll see more of this very, very avid and eager pursuit. So was that true? I think I could believe it. I mean, as we know, he was a very restless type. And when he got enthusiastic about something, he got really enthusiastic about it. So he might have pursued her. And she might have misconstrued that as him being just madly in love with her. Which, he never was. And that would be an issue, as we'll see in 1917, between the two of them, that she was telling him, "Oh, I'm going to come and join you in your exile even before the revolution, and I'm going to be with you." And he was like, no, let's not do that. And he tended to have that effect on women, I guess, because he could be so enthusiastic at first, but he did not fall in love with women. And he would write about that regretfully, at one point very explicitly in his diaries. I can't fall in love. And that wasn't, that wasn't true. I think he really did fall in love with Audrey despite her money. But we'll get to all that later. I'm digressing. Anyway, Lucia Marling was another one who thought that he'd fallen in love with her, and found out that it just wasn't the case. He was very fond of her. Okay, so I will stop there, and when we return, the wild pursuit will continue, and then we'll go on to their first meeting and how their relationship unfolded. So I don't know how much of that we'll get into tomorrow, but I'm already really enjoying this, and I hope you are too, and I'll see you next time. Bye.